Well, I want to thank you all for joining us today, and I'm very excited to share the results from our Indigenous Community Justice Knowledge Project. My students are students in the Applied Anthropology Methods course that I offer once a year. And it's usually a community engaged class. In fact, it's fundamentally a community engaged class. And so we have some sort of research project that involves community partners. And I've been teaching this class since probably 2008. So we've had lots of different community partners, some multi-year relationships and so forth. And this project today represents an iteration or a permutation of a multi-year relationship with partners in India. So we will be sharing with you some background on that. And my students are here to share the results of their own work on the project. So I will let them speak about a lot of the details, and then we'll have some room for questions and answers. So I'm going to start to share the screen here, and we'll go to the first slide just so you can see the title slide. And you see a bunch of names there. These are all the students in the class this semester who have dedicated a lot of their time and energy to not only doing some great learning, some great qualitative analysis, and doing some great qualitative analysis, but also working real hard to make this presentation happen today. So I want to thank them right out of the gate here for the work that they put into it. So what I'm going to do is actually introduce the project through a recording made by one of our students who couldn't attend today. Nick Luna did a recording of his own introduction, and so I will just show that first so that you get some background on the project from him, and then we'll move on to an introduction from some of our Indian partners, actually, so that they can kind of share their own perspective on what they're doing over there. So we'll begin with Nick.
Good afternoon, everyone. So in today's presentation, we're going to break down what we all kind of look at as a living project. Globalization, COVID-19, colonialism, oppression, climate change, all threaten the intangible heritage of Indigenous communities across the entire globe. The Indigenous Community Justice Knowledge Project hopes to preserve these oral traditions and knowledge held by those communities. For some background, the night before classes started, Professor Kimball returned from India after spending part of his winter break to meet with project partners, including international filmmaker Dakxin Chhara, the Bhasha Research and Publication Centre, and interview our community-based researchers and visit some of our interview sites. Kimball and our project partners working in India established relationships with Panchayats, the village councils of both the Chhara and Rathwa tribes. Some Panchayats in these communities are concerned that their communities are becoming less and less reliant on them, and so they want their knowledge preserved, while other Panchayats just want to share their knowledge and their oral traditions. Dakxin, his team, and members of the Chhara and Rathwa tribes spent hours conducting interviews and hours translating and assembling the transcripts from these village councils. The two tribes interviewed were the urban Chhara, who are a denotified nomadic tribe, and the rural Rathwa, who live in and continue to live in small villages. Professor Kimball and our partners put together the means to document oral knowledge with participatory ethnographic evaluations and the development of a remote training curriculum, so that our community-based researchers have a uniform interview guide, as well as the project aims, methods, and IRB protocols. With everything in place, the interviews commenced, translations were made and sent to us, and we as a class have begun to analyze Indigenous community knowledge through the use of coding with In Vivo. The ICJK, or the Indigenous Community Justice Knowledge, is the heart of our project. ICJ, or Indigenous Community Justice, is a form of customary law that arises from orally transmitted knowledge, experience, and traditional practices used to resolve disputes, protect assets, and is a form of intangible heritage. The ICJK project itself is a way to record, analyze, and preserve this knowledge, as Indigenous community justice is an important part in heritage management and preservation, as customary law can be found at the center of legal pluralism, or how the relationships between customary law and state-level legal systems can be identified and explained. The ICJK project hopes that recording and preserving this normally orally transmitted knowledge will help in the cultural survival of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Our research question is, what is the content itself of the Indigenous community justice knowledge, and how have Indigenous communities applied and adapted this knowledge in an ever-changing world?
Okay, so that's Nick introducing the project, and then we'll move on.
Good afternoon,
No,
everyone.
we won't.
So in today's
We're gonna try to move
presentation,
on
we're
here.
going
We don't need to hear Nick one more time. This is a video created by Bhasha Research and Publication Centre that includes some of the interviewees, some of the project collaborators from a village in India, Ratwa village in India, and also includes a Bhasha representative and some of our community, one of our community researchers. So I'll share that with you now.
મારું નામ સંધ્યા ગજ્જર, હું ભાષાની ટ્રસ્ટી હતી, પણ આ પ્રોગ્રામ, આ જે પ્રોજેક્ટ છે એમાં ઘણું બધું જે એનો જે વિચાર વ્યાપ એના પાછળ હતો, એમાં હું મારું અમુક કાર્ય હતું એમાં. એટલે આજે હું આ પહેલી વખતે આપણે આ ગામમાં આવીએ છીએ આવી રીતે ઇન્ટરવ્યૂ લેવા. અને મારા ખ્યાલથી આજનો અહીંયાનો આ ગામનો તો આ લોકોએ બહુ વ્યવસ્થિત રીતે જવાબ આપ્યા, અને કોઈ પણ જાતનો ડર કે કોઈ પણ જાતનું આમ કે તેમ કર્યા વગર એમને જે અમે પૂછ્યું એ વ્યવસ્થિત રીતે એમને કહ્યું. એટલે અમને એવું લાગે છે કે જે મુખ્ય કસ્ટમરી લૉઝ જનરલ સોસાયટી કે કોઈ પણ કમ્યુનિટીમાં લાગુ પડે એના જે વિષયો છે એ બધા જ વિષયો પર આપણે વાતચીત થઈ અને એ લોકોના શું અભિપ્રાય છે એ લોકોએ વ્યવસ્થિત રીતે કર્યા.
આજે આપણે અહીં બધા ભેગા જે થયા છે ને તે વડોદરામાં જે ભાષા કેન્દ્ર છે અને તેજગઢમાં આદિવાસી એકેડમી, એના દ્વારા અમેરિકામાં એક યુનિવર્સિટી છે નોર્ધન કોલોરાડો, એના સહયોગથી આપણે આ સંશોધન કાર્ય માટે એકઠા થયા છે. અને આ સંશોધનનો મુખ્ય હેતુ એ છે કે આપણા સમાજમાં જે વર્ષો જૂની ન્યાય પરંપરા છે, જે આપણા પંચો અત્યાર સુધી નિર્ણય લેતા હતા, સમાજમાં કોઈ પણ પ્રશ્નો બને તેને આપણે પંચ દ્વારા કઈ રીતે એનું હલ કરીએ. બરાબર, અત્યારે બીજી બધી ઘણી કાનૂની વ્યવસ્થાઓ આવી ગઈ છે, પણ જ્યારે આપણે ગામડાની વાત કરીએ અને આપણા સમાજની વાત કરીએ તો આપણે આપણા પ્રશ્નોનો હલ કરવા માટે પંચના સભ્યો ભેગા થઈને ગામના હિતમાં અને ગામના લોકોને એ સારું રહે તેના માટે આપણે નિર્ણયો લેતા હોય છે, જેને આપણે આપણી સમાજની પરંપરાગત જૂની ન્યાય પ્રણાલી વ્યવસ્થા કહીએ છીએ. તો આપણે આજની ચર્ચાનો મુખ્ય હેતુ આ છે કે આપણી જે જૂની ન્યાય પ્રણાલી છે, પરંપરા છે, આની જે માહિતી છે એ બધી આપણે આ વિડીયો ડોક્યુમેન્ટેશન દ્વારા એકઠી કરી એનું રિસર્ચ કરી અને એને કોઈ એક જગ્યાએ એવી રીતે રાખીએ કે જેથી આપણા સમાજના યુવાન છોકરાઓ જ્યારે ભણવા માટે આગળ વધે અને એમને આ પ્રકારના ડોક્યુમેન્ટેશન.
મારું નામ રામસિંહભાઈ હસુભાઈ રાઠવા છે, આદિવાસી એકેડમી તેજગઢથી આવ્યા છીએ. અને આ ભરૂચ ગામમાં જે પરંપરાગત રીતે પંચો જે ગામના પંચ તરીકે જે નિકાલ કરે છે એના કામ માટે આવ્યા હતા. આમ એમના પંચોના જાણવાથી એવું લાગ્યું કે જે પંચથી નિકાલ થાય છે એમાં પૈસાનો ખર્ચ, સમયનો ખર્ચ અને જે એકબીજાને જે દૂર થવાનો છે એ બધું પંચ દ્વારા નિકાલ કરવાથી સારું રહે. અને એમના જે પંચો જે નક્કી કરે છે તો પંચથી સરકારથી ઘણી વખત ઘણા બધા ગુનાઓમાં પણ જે સરકારના કામ કરે એ પણ પંચ કામ કરતી હોય છે અને બધા માણસો એને સમજી શકે છે. ગામના બધા જ લોકોનો અભિપ્રાય એટલે બધા ગામના લોકોનો અભિપ્રાય લેવામાં આવે, એમને પૂછવામાં આવે છે અને મૂકીને જે ગામના પંચો હોય એ બધાનું સાંભળ્યા પછી એમને એ લોકો સમાધાન કરતા હોય છે કે આને કોની ભૂલ છે અને કોની ભૂલ નથી એ જોઈને નિકાલ કરતા હોય છે. એ ખૂબ સારું છે. અને અત્યાર સુધી જે ગામડાની જે પરંપરાગત રીતે જે સમાજ પંચથી જે નિકાલ થાય છે એ અત્યાર સુધી કોઈ રેકોર્ડમાં કે કોઈ દસ્તાવેજમાં લખેલ નથી, પણ હવે પછી જો આ લખાણમાં થાય તો આવતી પેઢીને પણ કામ લાગી શકે એમ છે.
આદિવાસીઓનું જે જ્ઞાન છે એ મુખ્યત્વે મૌખિક જ્ઞાન પરંપરા રહી છે અને આદિવાસીઓની જે ન્યાય વ્યવસ્થા છે એમાં જે કાયદા કાનૂન જે લોકો બનાવતા હોય છે એ પણ મૌખિક રીતે જ આવનાર પેઢીમાં પણ એ લોકો લઈ જતા હોય છે. અને આજે બરોજ ગામમાં અમે એમના ગામની ન્યાય વ્યવસ્થા વિશે ખૂબ ઉમદા વાતચીત કરી અને જે બીજી ન્યાય વ્યવસ્થા છે, જે પોલીસ અને કોર્ટની જે ન્યાય વ્યવસ્થા છે એના કરતાં પણ વિભિન્ન અને ઉમદા ન્યાય વ્યવસ્થા આપણે અહીંયા આજે આ ગામમાં અમને જાણવા મળી છે. અને હું પણ જે રાઠવા સમુદાય છે એ જ સમુદાયમાંથી આવું છું અને મારો પણ એવો ઉદ્દેશ છે કે આ જે ન્યાય વ્યવસ્થા છે તે આવનાર પેઢી માટે પણ ક્યાંક લખાય, ક્યાંક ઓડિયો વિઝ્યુઅલ ડોક્યુમેન્ટેશન થાય અને આજે અમે કામ કર્યું છે એ ખૂબ જ જરૂરી છે આવનાર પેઢી માટે. મારું નામ સેજલ રાઠવા.
Okay. Well, that's just to give you an idea, a little bit of context for the part of the research that was actually collecting the data that then was delivered into the hands of my students who were learning to do qualitative analysis. I will try now to move to the next part. Yes, methods. So now we have the work of one of our students, Sawyer, will be sharing. Or is it Sawyer or is it Brianna? I can't remember. Is going to be sharing the methods. It's Brianna. Sorry. Okay. Go ahead, Brianna.
Yeah, hi everyone. So for this project, we were given transcripts that were first taken in their native language and then translated over to English, which took some time. So we didn't get all the transcripts at once. We worked on them in like waves. But once we got the transcripts, we put them into NVivo and figured out how to code them, which was a first for all of us. And then we were split into research teams, and we had 10 students in the class, which were split into 5 teams with 2 students each. And then after we received our first wave of transcripts, we came together as a class and determined the code book that we were using. And then after we got our second and third waves of transcripts, we met as a class and decided, some of these codes aren't working, or like, yeah, these codes really work, let's keep them. And then the data that we got around 12 Chhara transcripts and then 14 Rafa transcripts for a total of 26 total. And then if we move to the next slide, this is just a screenshot of the codebook that we used. This part of the codebook focuses on the types of property that we found that showed up in the transcript. So we have like animals, belongings, someone's house, someone's land, someone's money, which weren't necessarily things that were disputed over, just things that were kept showing up in the transcripts. And then we also had mentions of past and present, where the Paunch members would talk about how things have shifted in the past to how things are now. And sometimes they reflected upon this negatively, and sometimes they reflected upon this positively. We just wanted to combine them all into one section so later data analysis could be done. And then we also saw that there were differences between like the Paunch as a mention and then the Paunch structure as being mentioned. So we decided to separate those out into 2 different code books. And then the next slide, that's just a screenshot of NVivo with one of the transcripts in it. As you can see, Dakxin is the interviewer, and then Pradeep Barange is the person being interviewed, and then have the codes along the left side. So some of the methods that we used.
Thank you, Brianna. So now we're going to go step by step through the results that were compiled by each of our research teams, each of our 5 research teams. And each one is going to emphasize a different theme that arises from the whole in terms of themes that have been identified by the students across the semester. So we begin with team one, and we have Blake Moore here today to share this information with you.
So my research team focused on court avoidance and the punch outs using the punch system to avoid having their citizens go to court. And so they attempt to avoid having people go to courts for the police so that they save money, and the court system is extremely expensive in India. And so usually if somebody does end up going to court, then they won't be able to afford food for their families or other costs of living. And then India has a online reporting system now for the police. And if somebody goes through that online system, then when the police show up to the Chhara or the Rathwin villages, there's going to be somebody that gets arrested, even if they didn't really do anything wrong or anything that warrants being arrested. They're going to make any arrest just because of how their system works. And so we have a quote here from our transcript from the Bondi village. And these transcripts were transcribed 3 times through 3 different languages. So it's a little bit funky, but it says, "We thus avoid their going to court, because if they go to court, then back home their family members would be without food or money." And so that was a Rathwa village straight from the transcript that we got. And so the Panchayats resolve disputes immediately, and once they make their decision, then they're going to be final, and people move on from that. And if the Panchayats do place a fine on somebody in the dispute, then the money that they get for the fine goes straight back into the community that they're a part of.
Thank you, Blake. We'll move on to, we're going to have Allison here to explain results from, or a leading theme in the work of Research Team 2.
Hello, I'm Allison. Okay, so in my research team's research, we found that storytelling was a huge component and a topic in all of the transcripts. More specifically, we found that they like to tell morality tales to demonstrate a solution or an idea to resolve a dispute. Most of these were lesson learned stories that were revolved around Indian folklore and mythology of like kings and saints and such. My team's favorite story was a story about a crow, which I will tell you guys in a second. This story was being told to teach a lesson that it's not what's on the outside that what counts, it's what's on the inside, and we shouldn't compare ourselves to other people. And we have to remember that God made us all equal. And this story was used to solve conflict between inequality or unfairness between 2 parties. So if a party was disputing about something that they found to be unfair, this story can be used as a way of, it may seem unfair, but in reality, we are all equal. And so the story goes that there was this crow one day, and he was crying. And this saint found this crow, and it was like, "Why are you crying?" And the crow was like, "Well, I don't want to be a crow. I don't really like it that much. I want to change, and I want to be a dove." And the saint goes, "Okay, I can make you a dove as long as you go up to the dove and ask the dove if it likes being a dove." And that's exactly what this crow does. So it goes to the dove and it says, "Do you like being a dove?" And it goes, "I do not like being a dove." And so the crow thinks to himself and he goes, "Okay, instead, I want to be a parrot." So it goes back to the saint and tells the saint this, and the saint says the same thing. "Go to the parrot, ask if it likes being a parrot." So it goes to the parrot and asks, "Do you like being a parrot?" And the parrot says, "No, I do not." And so the crow says, okay, I'm going to be a peacock." So it does the same thing. It goes to the peacock, asks, "Do you like being a peacock?" And the peacock says no. And it goes back to the saint and it says, "None of these birds like to be these birds." And the moral of the story that the saint said was, yes, it's because you're choosing on what's on the outside. You're not choosing what's on the inside. And you have to remember that we are all equal and that it's not really what's on the outside that matters. It's what's on the inside. And that's a story that me and my partner, we found really like heartwarming and cute. And it was obviously our favorite story because of that. And that's just one of the reasons why we chose storytelling to present.
Thank you, Allison. That's great. We'll move on to research team 3 here. It's Anita Patain and Zygmunt Darszewski. Zygmunt, are you here to share the results of your? Yes, awesome. Okay, go for it.
So our focus was largely on the punitive versus restorative justice aspect. We found that as opposed to the kind of Western court system, which is really about just kind of punishing people, the Panches tended towards restorative justice or rehabilitative justice, which isn't to say that they wouldn't demand some sort of compensation for an offense, but rather that they work to preserve the offender as a member of the community. So there's a couple of forms of conflict resolution. It could just be a simple apology, or somebody would have to compensate the injured party, or there could be a compromise or some variation of the three. And as was previously stated, the government courts were only involved by the initiation of one of the parties in the conflict. So the Panch never directly approached the courts. And the police never really directly approached the Panch unless it's a situation that should be resolved by the Panch where somebody has gone to the police. Yeah, and so alongside this idea of restorative justice, found that there's no evidence in any of the transcripts of this notion of a criminal record that sticks around. And you know, in America, it's tough to get a job if you have a record, for example. And there's kind of similar issues in India, but with the Panch system, it's not the stain of the crime, as it were, is not kept up. And so the Panch generally tries to enforce what they view as an equitable solution. This generally involves splitting a piece of property equally among disputing members. So inheritance is split equally, and that includes among women if they choose to receive inheritance. As I just said, most instances of where somebody's disputing either land or wealth, they generally try to cut it in half, or if there's 3 people in thirds, et cetera, and give each claimant a share of about the same size. And so there are a couple of instances in which splits are not quite equitable. For example, there was one in one of our transcripts where 2 brothers were feuding over, I believe it was goats, and one of the brothers he did not approve of the Panch's decision, and so he ended up getting the courts involved, and it turns out that he killed the other brother's goat. And so there was more extensive fining and kind of a less equitable distribution of the property as a result of that refusal of the Panch's decision. And so we've got a couple of quotes here from the Kadkun village. They essentially, it's the same kind of avoiding the police and trying to work with this restorative justice. So they affirm that they only involve the police if the people who are feuding just refuse to accept the decision. But then additionally, they explicitly establish that they try to explain a crime to somebody who committed a crime before they approach the police or demand compensation. There's this aspect of trying to ensure that the person who has wronged others is aware that they have done so and gives recompense of their own will.
Thank you, Zygmunt. Okay, research team 4, we have Emily Rego and Sawyer Bentley. I don't know which one of you is going on this one, but because you're both here, but whoever's next, go ahead.
Yeah. Hi,
That would be Sawyer.
I'm Sawyer, and my partner was Emily, and I'll be sharing our research results. So within our team's transcript, we found the paunch structure theme within both communities. We actually noticed something interesting about how each community described this theme in a couple different ways, such as Chhara giving a little insight on the Panchayat everyday operations, while Rathwa highlights traditions within the Panchayat as well. Some interesting examples that we found within our transcript, within the Chhara, during the Panch meetings, members sit in round circles. And the community does this to see body language and facial expressions of others who are attending this meeting, which we thought was pretty interesting. Another thing that we found within the Rathwa's transcripts is that they actually tend to talk about more traditional things. I thought a good quote out of there that I also found pretty intriguing was this quote here, talking about how having to actually give a dowry for a marriage. And it's interesting because I actually thought dowry meant to give money to the man of the relationship, but in this translation, it is saying the opposite. So during the marriage, the boy actually gives money to the girl. Another thing that we wanted to point out, in our transcripts that our team analyzed within Chhara were conducted with one Panch member interviewee, and the Rathwa was interviewed within groups. And we are curious throughout this process to see if this research does continue, how different interviewees could help kind of round our findings. And that's what we came up with.
Thank you, Sawyer. On to last team, team 5, and I think we'll have Brianna sharing out the results from this one.
So our research team focused on how the Panchas mentioned how things have changed in the past and how they're reflected in the present. The past is very much seen as being better than the present, especially with the rise of technology and how that affects social relations. Technology makes it a lot easier to simply just file a police report online instead of actually bringing the issue up to the Panch, then them having to speak to all the parties involved and then coming up with a solution that's equitable for everyone. It's a lot easier just to file a police report online and then deal with it that way. So in one of our transcripts, there's a couple of quotes that we pulled out that we thought were particularly interesting. One of them being, there used to be many justice-loving people in the Panchayat. Those people used to do justice. Now those things are not there in today's Panchayat. And then in the present times, the justice of the Panchayat has become rotten. And for this reason, the educated section of the society are intelligent, but they do not like to sit in the Panchayat. So clearly there's some tensions between the people that are on the Panch and people that are not on the Panch and how well those sort of relations are. We just thought that was interesting.
Yeah, it is interesting, and it's clearly an area where we need to do more research. So it's really great that you surfaced that particular theme out of the myriad of other ones. So thank you for sharing that, Brianna. So now we're going to move to Miranda Bermudez, who is the research assistant for this project. She accompanied me actually to India and for her own research, but also to help out with the project. And so she's been instrumental in being able to build the curriculum around how to introduce in vivo to students, how to get the project rolling so that they can analyze the transcripts, but also has done her own analysis here using an aggregate of the results coming from the students' work. So Miranda, you want to take over?
Hi, like Kimball said, my name's Miranda. So I'm going to be talking about some of the matrix coding query results. So what that means is essentially it's a tool within the in vivo software, which kind of helps us analyze and throw around different scenarios. So these numbers reflect the references that the specific code in the transcripts when it arises. So for instance, if you look in this first matrix box, we have different types of property listed. And so animals was mentioned once, coded once. And so these kind of reflect just the references of specific codes. So with that, I also wanted to discuss the differences in the amount of transcripts that we analyzed. So ultimately, because we received transcripts in waves from each of our India project partners, we kind of got them just in uneven amounts. So it's important to preface this data with the fact that this is just still really preliminary findings because of just the unequalness of how many transcripts we have from each tribe. So that should be noted when looking at this data. So specifically, I wanted to pull up here and just show a comparison of the types of property that are discussed. Brianna's group kind of talked about this a little bit, but they're not always, these don't reflect conflicts per se. These just reflect the number of times these specific property items were mentioned in the transcripts. So I think it's interesting to compare between Chhara and Ratwa what types of property we see come up in the transcripts. Secondly, you can kind of look at some of the resolutions. So because the Paunch and their role is mediation and conflict within strife in the community, I think that it's important to kind of look at the ways in which the Paunch tries to help bring resolution, and comparing those between tribes is very interesting. So here we have 3 of those resolution types listed: apologies, compensation, and then also another prevailing thing we've talked about is the use of police or courts. And just mentioning of that is what those numbers reflect. So the very bottom box here, we see that even with more Chhara transcripts than Ratwa, it's interesting to see that we have similar values here in looking at the Paunch versus court code. So, you know, this is something that some of my colleagues have brought up, but it's just a prevailing theme to kind of understand the importance of the Paunch for these communities and the restorative justice element of it that they provide to the community over the formal court system and justice system in India. And so I think as we start to get more of these transcripts in and coded, it'll be interesting to kind of keep an eye on this Paunch versus court code because of its prevalence and themes throughout both tribes in some way or another.
Great. Thank you, Miranda. Okay, we'll have, is it Allison, are you talking about limitations? I believe so.
Awesome. Hello, it's me again. So the limitations that we found, there are 4 major limitations. The first one is language barrier. These transcripts, like said, were in their local dialect, and then they got translated into Hindi and then into English. And so because of this, we have to keep in mind that what they originally said or expressed may not be what we gathered at the end. And it may be harder for us to understand exactly what they're saying. And that made our results different because of that. Because of language and culture and everything, we have a huge cultural barrier to go along with that. They live very different lives than us, and it's our jobs as anthropologists to have ethical considerations in mind, learning about a life that seems so foreign to us, but familiar to them. this is a huge difference, or this is a huge difference between them living in India and us in the States. Because of this, we're going to naturally have very different ideas and beliefs than them about everyday tasks and cultural norms. And it's important that we remember that when we're reading these transcripts and trying to understand them, that there's just a huge difference between them and us. And then the last two, they go very hand in hand with another. So we had a very, very small sample size. These interviews only took place in 2 communities, and out of those communities, not everybody got to be interviewed. Because of this, we had to keep in mind that we have a very small sample of the truth compared to the whole picture and the rest of what's going on. And that goes into the 4th point, which is we're not able to hear from everyone. The only people that were interviewed were men in the Panchayat or closely related to the Panchayat in some way. This meant that people that weren't related to the system in any way did not get to be interviewed about it. And most importantly, women were not interviewed about this. Women, they do take a role in the Panchayat and they are involved in the community, but they were not able to get interviewed. And I think it's just because they have different cultural traditions when it comes to gender roles and stuff like that. So they were not able to really speak out against it or for it or whatever they thought. And that was just another limitation that we found a little hard to overcome. But yeah.
Thanks, Allison. So just a few conclusions, and then we'll open it up for any questions that anyone has. So the project, as Allison pointed out, the project, it's a relatively small sample size. I would phrase it a little differently. Rather than 2 communities, it's really 2 tribal groups. The Chhara are denotified nomadic tribal members, and I can explain that in the Q&A what that actually means. And they're urban. They're essentially urban settled tribal, an urban settled tribal group with a longstanding stigma of being criminalized since 1871 by the British. So they live in Ahmedabad in a neighborhood called Charnagar. Then we have the Ratwa tribe, which has several villages in a region in predominantly eastern Gujarat. And so they have many different villages, and we have transcripts from around, trying to do the numbers again here. I think we have 14 different villages have the Panchayats of 14 different villages have been interviewed, but there are many more villages and other Adivasi, which is to say original people in the translation, tribal groups in Gujarat and beyond. And so Allison's quite right that, it's really hard to get a bigger picture of what kind of knowledge is being kept and shared by the Panchayats with a small sample, but we do hope to expand that. So we are the remaining week that we have left in the semester, we're going to be completing the analysis of the transcripts we got in recently. We're going to be uploading our content to Digital UNC, which is a digital archive housed at in the University of Northern Colorado Libraries. And that's a publicly accessible archive, so other researchers can take advantage of the data, and other people anywhere in the world who have internet access can access that information. We hope to, of course, publish the project results, and we've submitted a pre-proposal to the National Geographic Society for a level 1 research project, which, if it's approved, we'll be invited to submit a full proposal, and if that wins an award, we'll be continuing our project, expanding our coverage of villages in Gujarat and also in Madhya Pradesh and Rajasthan and surrounding areas. So we're going to try to, over the course of some years, expand that data collection net, if you will, so that we can keep building the project and keep preserving this intangible heritage. And of course, that yields more data for my applied anthropology students to analyze. By the way, these 2 pictures here were extracted from a painting, mural actually, made by Ratwa I hesitate to call them artists. I can explain this later, but it's a ritual context in which these paintings are made, and they were just taken out by one of the students to put in here to enhance the image. And these are our partners right now: Bhasha Research and Publication Centre, which you heard a little bit from; Dakxin Chhara, who's he's a filmmaker, internationally recognized filmmaker, also a Chhara member in Charnagar, and one of the founders of Budhan Theatre, which is an invisible theater, or a theater of the oppressed. That is a separate topic we could talk about too. And of course, the Panchayat members from the Chhara and Ratwa tribes. And then we received funding to make this happen. We received funding through a UNC Provost Seed Grant, which made it possible for us to lay the foundation for hopefully future work as we expand the project. Okay, I'm gonna stop the share here, and thank you all for listening, and thank my students for doing a great job presenting the results, and open it up for questions.
Yeah, well, first I'd like to thank all of the students that presented today. It was a really thought-provoking and exciting presentation. And I guess one question that kind of popped into my head really immediately is, has there been anything coming up about the relationship between the formal state court system and the Panch, as far as, like the power sharing? How do they feel about?
Yeah, that's a great question, Lucor. Maybe I might be in the best position to answer that one. And so I will try. So what we find, I think what we found in the transcripts, and certainly what I found in my visit to India with interviewing the community researchers and spending some time with the Panchayat members themselves, and then also speaking with our partners, that you can roughly put the Chhara and the Ratwa into two different places that, two different ways they come down on that question that you're asking. For the Chhara, because they were criminalized by the British through the Criminal Tribes Act in 1871, they were stigmatized. They were called literally born criminals, and they carry that stigma with them even to this day. So their relationship with the police, not so good. In fact, their Charnagar, the neighborhood, has a reputation for being raided periodically by police. And so they really have a strong incentive to avoid interactions with the police in ways that would, be focused on some kind of conflict resolution or dispute resolution. The Ratwa have a better relationship with the police. They are settled agricultural Adivazis. They have their own challenges, and it has a lot to do with social change that's happening and political change that's happened over the last several years, and other factors that are beyond their control that they're trying to manage. And one of those is that as they become slowly, some members anyway, become economically more advantaged, there's less inclination on the part, let's say, of younger people to adhere to the traditions, some of the traditions anyway. And that's a whole topic to talk about. That's absolutely fascinating. But they have in general, they seem to have a better relationship with the police. And as I think it was Blake mentioned, now the government has made it possible for people to just go online to request an investigation of some kind. And if they do that, then the police have to investigate, as Blake pointed out. And so in so doing, something has to be done. They have to find a bad guy, if you will. So that can be very expensive for people. And as Zygmunt pointed out, it can lead to a criminal record, which makes it very difficult to find employment after that. So there's a lot of incentive to avoid going through the official channels of the police. Now, that said, it's interesting to note that individual Ratwa who visit the police station and don't yet submit one of those official requests, oftentimes the police will respond by saying, well, let's talk to the Panch first. So the police will then get in touch with the Panch members from their community, from their village, and to find out more context and to understand and to figure out if they should be involved or not. So it's a little bit more collaborative on the part of that system there for the Ratwa. So anyway, that's one way to kind of characterize the difference. I hope that addresses your question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank you.
I had a question that's semi-related. I want to hear more about how they're the storytelling aspect and the theater of the oppressed aspect. My own graduate research was on a social justice theater troupe out of Denver. So, I'm always very interested in that topic.
Yes, you and I had a conversation recently where you brought that up, and I didn't mention what we're doing there. This is outside of the domain of my students' work. So once again, I'll step in and address it. Miranda knows something about this too, though. So Miranda, I want to invite you to say what comes to mind too. The Budhan Theatre was set up a number of years ago. I've forgotten how many, through some interaction with individuals who came to the Chhara, who were very involved in activism of one kind or another, and we're concerned about issues of the criminalization, the stigma of criminalization, and wanted to introduce ways to resist that, but not violently. And so the Chhara, it's a very interesting. Okay, so denotified nomadic tribe means that they were notified by the British. That's just the bureaucratic terminology, as a result of the Criminal Tribes Act. And that means that information about them was even woven into the curriculum for police academies. So it said, if a crime is committed in this area, likely it was one of these, it was the Chhara or something like that. And so, as you can imagine, things got pretty bad for them as a result of that. Plus, they were nomadic people, and so they were a threat to the British government because they couldn't be pinned down. And we see that, of course, in different parts of the world where mobile people are a threat to the social order that a particular government wants to maintain. And so they tried to settle them. So they had essentially they had internment camps right there in Charnagar, where they were given a curfew, and they had to be in at a certain time, and they were monitored by British troops, British authorities. And so they were, but they have a long tradition of being actors and even professional thieves. And so there's a lot of art, the art of the thief woven into their culture. And so the idea of creating a theater project came naturally to them. And there was a person, not a Chhara person, but another denotified by Nehru in 1952, I think, meaning that they were taken off that list, but they kept the stigma. So there was another village of denotified nomadic tribal people who one of whose members was beaten to the point of dying by the police. And so that became a story that really resonated with the communities as a powerful way of raising awareness. So they developed Budhan Theatre, named after the individual who was murdered. And they would do these kind of pop-up theater productions. So they would do it in their own community in order to raise awareness of their own members about their history and their heritage and their plight. And then they would go out into the mainstream society and do the same. Even the police academy, they would do these theater productions right on the steps of the police academy, and it's made a big difference over the years in terms of that effort to raise awareness. Lots more to be said there, and I can send you a link, Michael, that would take you to the Budhan Theatre and give you a lot more background on it.
Yeah. I'd love to do that. Yeah, the group I worked with is called the Romero Theater Troupe, and I did a film on them and stuff. And
awesome. Yeah.
So there's lots of stuff up online on my YouTube channel about them if you guys are interested.
Fantastic.
But yeah, no, it's so important. I mean, it sounds like this whole project is really about humanizing the law. Mm-hmm. And so I was just wondering if some of the students could speak to that a little bit.
Nice. Yeah. Would you like to handle it, or more than one?
I sort of speak to it. It's, I don't know, it's interesting because there's kind of multiple layers to the perception that's been built. There's, there's the knowledge of the stereotyping and the negative history surrounding the people groups. And then there's the kind of knowledge of them as a whole people group, basically general cultural knowledge, religious practices, that kind of thing. And of course, that's interesting as an anthropologist, but then especially with the transcripts, because a lot of them are individual transcripts or individual interviews, there is a pretty strong development of that more, I guess, diversified view of the people. So, it's not just, oh, I read an article that they do these drawings or whatever. It's kind of getting to understand specific individuals' views of their own society. I hope that contributes.
Thank you, Zygmunt. That's great. Anyone else want to share any thoughts on that? Okay. So, ready for any other questions you might have? I see that we actually are making it darn close to our 1 hour.
I have a question.
Yeah, Teresa.
Actually, I have a couple of questions. Actually, I have more than questions, but I'll just start with one. So I don't know if I missed this, but who designed the project? Who did the design of the project?
Yeah, that's a great question. It was a very collaborative effort, but the seed of the idea came from Dakxin Chhara, because he's recognized the powerful role that storytelling plays among denotified nomadic tribes. So he approached me and said, is there any way to make this happen? Because I'd love to start collecting this kind of heritage is being lost, and I'd love to be able to collect it so that, again, we can try to raise awareness in this way. He wants to do documentaries, he wants to do book projects and so forth. So at that time, coincidentally, our UNC provost had issued, our former UNC provost had issued a seed grant competition. And so I just jumped on it. And then I involved our partners from past projects. We worked with Bhasha Research and Publication Centre, as well as Dakxin and other Chhara members. And so I reached out to them and said, could we do this for the Ratwa as well? And they agreed, and they brought their own perspective and their own methodology and their own insights and experience and connections to the project. So really, that's where the collaboration really started to cook. So it began with Dakxin wondering with me about whether this would be possible, and then it just evolved into this really great collaboration.
And within that, who created the questions for the interviews?
So I built the questions first, and then shared them out with Dakxin and the Bhasha folks. And they went through them and modified them, added to them. And so we built kind of a corpus of at least prospective questions to guide the interviews. What's interesting is that they went in different directions. So for Dakxin, in keeping with his desire to collect stories, what we found in the transcripts is that, there's a lot more stories being told, the morality tales that Allison mentioned and so forth. For the Ratwa, it was more comprehensive. They asked more questions about the structure of the Panch, how disputes are resolved, specifically examples and so forth. So it seems to be like I say, a sort of more comprehensive look at the knowledge itself. But the rich stories that we now have to record and to preserve, a lot of those are coming from the Chhara. Now, what we hope to do with the National Geographic Society grant, if we get it, is to return our attention to those stories, because I think the stories are something that every group has. It's just that the questions you ask, of course, elicit different kinds of answers. So it's been an interesting process.
Will the students that has, by the way, like, thank you so much for bringing this to us and share all of this work that you have done. So will these students go to the site in the continuation of the project, or how is this going to develop if you get like go for all those proposals?
Right. Yeah, students have this annoying habit of graduating. So if we could keep them around.
You're interested? No.
So a number of our students are graduating or will be graduating soon. And we don't have the money right now to grants to be able to support that kind of thing. The level 1 grant from NGS is pretty small. I might be able to have one student join me, but the bigger level 2 grant, if we can just keep moving ahead with this, that's a bigger grant. And then I see why it would be possible, or how it would be possible to make that happen. But it's something that's going to have to roll out over a few years before we can get there.
And one more thing that I'm just curious if any of you have a comment or more insight about, like, it caught my attention, the online tool for reporting. And that was something that was, like not in track to the project that you were like developing. But I was wondering if that online tool is just it's just something that might help women in those communities to report, or to prevent retaliation or protection when they are like, in cases of rape, which it's very prevalent, or, domestic violence, if the way that we call domestic violence, there's other kind of abuses. So I was wondering if you have any comment onto that, and how that, it's robbing against the system for the Chhara and the Ratwa.
I'm curious to know what Miranda thinks, because Miranda, as it happens, is doing her honors thesis on changing gender roles for the Chhara by interviewing women in the Chhara community. But she, like I said, was an assistant with and so she was there while we were meeting with all the other Panchayats for the Ratwa as well. So Miranda, what comes up for you when you hear that question?
That's interesting that you asked that, because, when we were out there talking, the e-file system came up, and that was one of my thoughts too. But it's also interesting to see, I guess, Chhara aside, just because of the historic issue and conflict with the police. It's interesting to see that the police do collaborate and do talk to the Panch. So I like the e-file system as an option, as you were saying, just as a way for a woman or anyone who feels attacked in that manner or has been harmed in that manner to just sidestep all of this stuff and move towards a more serious mode of, using the formal justice system to make sure that they receive justice. So I like that they have that option now. I think that we're seeing some of the issues and some of these transcripts arise when the e-filing system is used for lesser things like a dispute over property or two brothers in conflict, or a woman leaving a man, and just some of the sticky things that can happen there. It's when the e-filing is used for those types of things that I think that they're seeing, you know, undue strain on finances, when those are the types of disputes that the paunch are perfect for. They are completely set up for that. But, you know, I also think too, with these rural villages, so specifically looking at the Ratwa, it's awesome to have this e-file for that specific reason, because they're in rural areas. So it's harder for them to get to a police station. It's harder for them to say they were being abused over time to get away from their abuser. So I don't think that the e-file system is necessarily like just, you know, the most horrible thing, but it's interesting to consider the ways in which that offers a platform for, you know, women specifically to have. So I don't know, I was all over the place on that. I hope I was able to speak to that a little bit.
So it's interesting to hear, you know, what you're saying. So thank you. Yes. I mean, I could keep talking, but I think that we have, like, and I have more questions, but this is so good. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
So I think we are out of time, aren't we? I'm amazed, because I really had it in my head that we would be done early. And I am so grateful to all of you for joining us today. You know, we really enjoy it when folks from obviously the anthropological community can come and listen to what we're doing and share such great questions and just show, you know, just connect with us in this way. So I'm really grateful to all of you for being here.